Some debates in life aren't just about words, they're about power. When an arrogant professor humiliates a student in front of an entire class, the tension reaches a boiling point. What happens when the person he least expects stands up and fires back? Let us know in the comments below before we dive into this unforgettable story. The room was packed. Rows of students sat with their laptops open, notebooks ready, and eyes fixed forward. It wasn't just another lecture, it was his lecture. Dr. Richard Thornton, a professor infamous for his biting critiques and withering comments, strutted into the room like a king surveying his court. He didn't just teach, he dominated. Every semester, students braced themselves for the storm of arrogance and razor-sharp belittlement that came with his class. Layla Jenkins sat in the second row, her fingers wrapped around the edge of her desk. She had heard the stories. How he called students intellectually lazy, how he dismissed entire schools of thought with a wave of his hand, and most of all, how he never seemed to respect black students the way he did their white counterparts. She had seen it in subtle ways. The way he nodded in approval when certain students spoke, but raised an eyebrow in skepticism when others did. It was all there just under the surface. The first time it happened to her, she thought she imagined it. "Ah, Ms. Jenkins," he said on the first day, scanning his roster. "I assume you're here to offer a fresh perspective? I do love diverse opinions." His smile was thin, calculated. Layla blinked. The way he said diverse made it sound less like an asset and more like a liability. She had smiled politely, not taking the bait, but as the weeks passed, it became clear. Dr. Thornton had a habit of directing his hardest, most dismissive critiques at students who looked like her. Today was no different. "The philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche," Thornton began, pacing in front of the whiteboard, "is often misunderstood by those who fail to grasp the nuances of his existential thought, and yet many people attempt to apply his work where it does not belong." He paused, then turned to Layla. "Mr. Jenkins, since you seem particularly engaged today, perhaps you'd like to enlighten us with your thoughts?" Layla felt the weight of every eye in the room shift onto her. It was a familiar tactic: call out the black student, put them on the spot, and watch them stumble. But Layla didn't stumble. "Sure," she said smoothly, sitting up straight. Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch suggests an individual who transcends societal norms, creating their own values rather than following the ones imposed upon them. But I'd argue that this idea, intentionally or not, has been historically manipulated to justify systems of oppression rather than challenge them. A slow, deliberate smirk stretched across Thornton's face. "Ah, and you base this claim on what, exactly? A tweet you saw this morning?" A few students chuckled. Layla exhaled sharply through her nose. "On Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals," she shot back, unfazed, "in which he argues that morality is often constructed by those in power to maintain their dominance. That would suggest that—" Yes, I know the text," Thornton interrupted with a dramatic sigh. "But the problem here is your need to insert oppression into every discussion. It's a tired, predictable lens. Philosophy is about logic, not personal grievances." Layla felt her jaw tighten. There it was. That subtle attempt to belittle, to delegitimize her argument by making it sound emotional rather than intellectual. She forced herself to remain calm. "And yet," she said, keeping her voice measured, "you teach philosophy as though it exists in a vacuum, divorced from the real world, when in fact it has always been a tool used to shape power structures." Thornton's smirk faded. "That's an oversimplification." "It's history," Layla corrected. The room was still. Students glanced between the two, waiting to see who would blink first. Thornton's smile returned, but it was colder now. "Tell me, Miss Jenkins, since you seem to have all the answers, who would you consider the most important philosopher of the last 200 years? Layla knew this game. He wanted her to name a black thinker so he could tear them apart. "Depends on what you mean by important," she replied. "Oh, Don't be coy, Thornton said, feigning amusement. Name one. She did. Angela Davis. Thornton scoffed. A political activist, not a philosopher. Wrong, Layla countered. Her work on critical theory, particularly Are Prisons Obsolete, challenges the very nature of societal structures, something you claim philosophy is about. Thornton waved a dismissive hand. Ah, yes, the critical theory crowd. More concerned with activism than intellectual rigor. These so-called thinkers are more interested in dismantling than understanding. Layla leaned forward, her voice steady. If philosophy is only about understanding and never questioning who holds power in that understanding, then what's the point? Isn't questioning the foundation of all philosophical thought? The professor narrowed his eyes. He had underestimated her. A few students murmured, some nodded, others glanced at Thornton, waiting for his next move. Layla knew what was coming. He'd try to twist her words, dismiss her again. But before he could, another voice cut through the tension. She's right. Layla turned. It was Ethan. One of Thornton's favorites, white, upper class, always praised for his brilliant insights. And yet, here he was, agreeing with her. Thornton's gaze snapped toward Ethan, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," the professor asked. Ethan shrugged. "She's right. You always tell us philosophy is about questioning assumptions, but every time she questions yours, you brush her off." A low murmur rippled through the room. Thornton's jaw tightened. That is not what's happening here. Layla smiled. Then what is happening, Dr. Thornton? For the first time, the professor had no immediate response. Silence stretched across the lecture hall. Layla didn't need to say anything else. The room had seen what had just happened, and that was enough. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She sat back, folding her arms. If questioning the dominant narrative makes me predictable, then what does refusing to answer uncomfortable questions make you? The weight of the question hung in the air. Thornton's eyes darkened, but before he could open his mouth, the bell rang. Class was over. Students rose from their seats, some stealing glances at Layla, others shaking their heads at Thornton. He stood motionless, gripping the edge of his desk, his face unreadable. Layla packed up her things slowly. She could feel his stare, but she didn't acknowledge it. She had made her point, and judging by the murmurs in the room, everyone else knew it too. The next class should have felt like any other, but it didn't. There was an energy in the air that wasn't just tension, it was expectation. Something had been cracked open, and everyone in the room could feel it. The dynamic had shifted. Layla wasn't just another student anymore. She was the student who had stood up to him. Dr. Thornton entered with his usual slow, measured steps, but his presence no longer held the same weight. He wasn't the sole authority in the room anymore. His control had been punctured, and no amount of posturing could fully repair it. The students weren't looking at him the way they used to. Some looked at him with skepticism now, others with amusement. He set his leather satchel down with more force than necessary, clearing his throat as he removed his reading glasses. "Before we begin today's lecture," he said, keeping his tone neutral, "I want to address something." Layla didn't move. "As many of you have no doubt noticed," he continued, "our last few classes have taken an unusual turn." A few students exchanged glances, waiting to see where he was going with this. "It seems," he said, folding his hands in front of him, "that some of you have mistaken a philosophical debate for a personal attack." The room went still. "I have been accused, both directly and indirectly, of dismissing certain perspectives," he went on, his voice carefully controlled, "of failing to engage with certain ideas. Let me be clear. My role in this classroom is not to make anyone feel comfortable. It is to challenge you, to make you question your assumptions, to push you beyond what you think you know." His eyes locked onto Layla's, sharp, probing. Some of you may feel that philosophy should serve activism, he said. Others may believe it should remain an intellectual pursuit, separate from the chaos of the real world. That is an ongoing debate. His voice dropped slightly. But what is not up for debate, he continued, is the importance of respect in this classroom. A few students shifted in their seats. I welcome discussion, he said, his voice lighter now, almost magnanimous. I welcome disagreement, but I will not tolerate an environment where academic rigor is sacrificed for ideological grandstanding. Layla let the words sit for a beat before she spoke. Respect goes both ways, she said simply. A few students exhaled, as if they'd been holding their breath. Thornton let out a sharp, thin smile. Indeed it does. For the next 45 minutes, he tried to teach as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't lost control of the narrative. But it was there, underneath every word, every forced pause. His authority was still intact, technically. But it wasn't absolute anymore, and he knew it. As class ended, students began filing out, but a few lingered near Layla's desk. Ethan, of course, but also a few others. Students who had never spoken to her before, but who had been watching. That was wild, one of them muttered, shaking their head. He's really trying to save face. Layla shrugged. Let him. Ethan smirked. You know he hates that he can't shut you down, right? Layla gave a small smile, but she wasn't celebrating. There was nothing to celebrate. Honestly, she said, packing up her laptop, I don't care what he thinks. Yeah, but I care what happens next, she said, because this wasn't just about a classroom. This was about what happened in every space where power went unchecked. Every space where people like Dr. Thornton dictated the rules, controlled the conversations, and dismissed the voices that didn't fit their worldview. One debate hadn't changed the world, but it had changed something, and that was enough. For now. She slung her bag over her shoulder and walked out of the room, leaving Thornton behind, still clutching onto whatever authority he had left. The room was buzzing before class even began. Students huddled in small groups, whispering, eyes flicking toward the empty desk at the front of the room. Dr. Thornton wasn't there yet. That alone was unusual. He was always the first to arrive, always in control. But not today. Layla sat at her usual spot, calm on the outside but alert. Something had shifted after last class. It wasn't just about the debate anymore, it was about him. She had seen it in the way his voice lost its edge, in the way he struggled to find a counter-argument. Thornton wasn't used to being challenged, and now he had to come back and close the debate. The door swung open. Thornton walked in, slower than usual, carrying a stack of papers. He wasn't dressed as sharply, his tie was slightly loosened, his usual air of effortless authority now replaced with something stiffer, something forced. He knew. He knew this class wasn't his anymore. He placed his papers on the desk and exhaled, scanning the room before speaking. Well, he said, his voice measured, I assume you're all eager to conclude our little exercise? Silence. The weight of unspoken words filled the air. Ms. Jenkins, he said, turning his gaze toward her. I trust you've prepared your closing argument. Layla nodded, standing. But she didn't rush. She took a moment, looking around the room, making eye contact with a few students before she spoke. We've spent the last 2 classes debating the role of philosophy, she began. Dr. Thornton argues that philosophy should remain an intellectual pursuit, free from politics, free from activism. But I'd like to ask, when has that ever been true? She turned, gesturing toward the blackboard where his argument from the last class was still faintly visible beneath the eraser marks. Plato's Republic wasn't just a thought experiment. It was a blueprint for governance. Rousseau's The Social Contract helped fuel revolutions. Marx's writings changed the course of history. If philosophy has always been used to shape the world, then why should we stop now? She paused, letting the question settle before continuing. The idea that philosophy should remain pure is convenient for those who benefit from things staying the same, but for the rest of us it's not a luxury we can afford. We don't study ideas in a vacuum, we live them. And when the world around us is built on systems of oppression, ignorance isn't neutrality, it's complicity. A murmur moved through the room. Thornton sat rigid, hands clasped together on his desk. Layla looked directly at him now. You asked me last class what happens when philosophy is used for the wrong purpose. But I'd ask you, what happens when it's used for nothing at all? She exhaled. That's all. She took her seat, but the energy in the room stayed high. Thornton adjusted his tie, clearing his throat before he spoke. Well, he said, smiling but without warmth. I must admit, Miss Jenkins, you certainly know how to hold a room. A few students chuckled nervously, but no one relaxed. But let's not mistake rhetorical flair for a strong argument, he continued, standing now, his usual confidence seeping back in. You cite philosophers who have influenced change, but what you fail to mention is that they were often misunderstood in their time, their ideas distorted, even weaponized. He took slow steps across the room. Marx's work led to totalitarian regimes. Nietzsche's words were twisted into the philosophy of fascism. Even Socrates, your beloved example of intellectual rebellion, was executed for corrupting the youth. He turned, meeting Layla's gaze directly. You say philosophy must be used for action, he said. But history shows us that action, without careful thought, leads to disaster. Layla let the words hang between them. She could feel the room shifting again, some students nodding at Thornton's words, others still on the fence. He had delivered his rebuttal well, but he had made one critical mistake. She smiled. So, what you're saying, she said slowly, is that philosophy does have an impact, that it has shaped history, that it has been used to justify real-world decisions. Thornton's jaw tightened. You just proved my point, she said. The room broke into hushed murmurs. Some students laughed outright. Thornton's lips pressed into a thin line. I believe we're done here, he said, his voice clipped. But it wasn't over. Ethan, who had been silent for most of the class, raised his hand. Actually, he said, we were supposed to vote. Thornton looked like he had swallowed glass. Yes, well... A different student, a quiet girl in the back, cut in. I think we should vote, she said. Thornton's fingers curled at his side. He couldn't say no without making it obvious he was trying to avoid the result. Fine, he said stiffly. A show of hands. Who believes Miss Jenkins presented the stronger argument? Layla sat back, watching. At first, only a few hands went up, Ethan, a few others. Then more. And more. Thornton watched in silence as over half the class raised their hands. He inhaled sharply through his nose, then gave a tight nod. Very well. Layla felt no rush of victory. She hadn't needed the class's approval to know she was right. But the fact that they had seen it too, that meant something. Class was dismissed. Students filed out, some stopping to glance at Thornton, others whispering amongst themselves. Layla packed up her things at her usual pace, not rushing. She felt Thornton's eyes on her, but didn't acknowledge them. As she slung her bag over her shoulder and made her way to the door, Thornton spoke. Miss Jenkins. She stopped, but didn't turn. Enjoy this moment, he said, his voice low. But don't mistake a classroom victory for the real world. Out there, the rules are different. Layla finally turned, tilting her head. They are, she agreed, but out there, you don't control the narrative. She gave him a polite smile. See you next class, Professor. And with that, she walked out. The next class was different. There was an energy in the air, a quiet buzz beneath the usual rustling of papers and clicking of laptop keys. Layla could feel it before she even sat down. The glances, the whispers, the unspoken acknowledgement that last class hadn't ended in the usual way. Dr. Thornton had lost control. Normally, his lectures ended with a neatly tied bow, his voice the final word. But not this time. Layla's challenge had left the discussion open-ended, unfinished. He hadn't shut her down like he had so many before her, and now the class was waiting. For what? They didn't know. But something had shifted. Thornton knew it too. He walked in with his usual air of arrogance, but something in his demeanor was off. Less casual, more controlled. He wasn't pacing like he usually did. He wasn't scanning the room with his practiced ease. Instead, he placed his leather satchel on the desk, adjusted his cufflinks, and let the silence settle. It was a strategy. He wanted the room to feel his presence before he spoke. "Last class," he finally said, his voice calm, deliberate, "we had quite the discussion." Layla remained still. She wouldn't take the bait. "Not yet. I must admit," he continued, walking slowly to the front of the room, "I was impressed. Passion, conviction, even a bit of intellectual rebellion. It's good to see. It shows that philosophy is still alive." A few students chuckled. "But," he added, eyes flickering to Layla for the briefest moment, "passion is not the same as precision, and conviction is not the same as truth." Layla exhaled slowly. "Here we go." "So," Thornton continued, clasping his hands in front of him, "today we're going to do something different. A debate." The murmur started again. This wasn't how his lectures worked. Thornton controlled the conversation. He dictated what was worth discussing. He didn't debate students. "I want to hear your thoughts," he said, a slight smirk curling his lips. "And since Miss Jenkins has been so eager to challenge conventional wisdom, I think it's only fair she defend her position in a more structured format." Now every head turned. Layla met his gaze evenly. "I don't remember volunteering," she said. Thornton chuckled. "Oh, but you did, every time you opened your mouth to correct me." A few students laughed, but others, especially Ethan, stayed quiet. They were waiting to see if she'd accept. Layla took her time. She wasn't about to be manipulated into walking into a trap. "What's the topic?" she asked finally. Thornton's smile widened. He had her. "The role of philosophy in activism," he said smoothly. "You argue that philosophy should be used to challenge power structures. I argue that philosophy should remain an intellectual pursuit, free from the constraints of political agendas." Layla resisted the urge to smirk. He thought he was setting her up for failure, but in reality, he had just given her everything she needed. "All right," she said, closing her notebook. "Let's do it." A ripple of excitement moved through the class. No one had ever seen Thornton formally debate a student. He had his favorites, the ones he let ramble as he indulgently corrected them, but this was different. Thornton nodded approvingly, as if she were a student finally falling into place. He turned to the board and wrote 2 names in bold letters. Philosophy as intellectual pursuit, Dr. Richard Thornton. Philosophy as a tool for change, Layla Jenkins. He underlined both, then turned back to face the class. "We'll keep it simple," he said. "Opening arguments, rebuttals, closing statements." Layla folded her arms. "Who's judging?" "The class," Thornton said. "They'll decide whose argument holds more weight." Layla scanned the room. It was a mix, some students eager to see her fail, some curious, and some, like Ethan, clearly rooting for her. It didn't matter. She wasn't here to win them over. She was here to win the argument. Thornton gestured for her to begin. Layla stood, smoothing her hands over her jeans before stepping forward. She had no notes, no pre-written speech, just her mind and her words. "Philosophy has never been separate from power," she began. "From Socrates to Karl Marx, the greatest thinkers of every era have questioned authority, challenged systems, and influenced change. To argue that philosophy should remain an intellectual pursuit is to ignore the reality of its impact. Philosophy shapes society. It determines who gets to be heard, whose ideas are legitimized, and who gets left out of the conversation altogether. She let that sink in before continuing. Even the idea that philosophy should be neutral is in itself a political stance. It suggests that the world as it is doesn't need questioning, that the systems in place should remain unchallenged. But if philosophy is truly about understanding the world, then we have a responsibility to apply it, not just in books, but in action. She glanced at Thornton. That's all for now. He smiled, as if amused, then rose to his feet. Well, he said, exhaling, that was passionate. More chuckles. But passion is not argument, he continued. It is an appeal to emotion, a distraction from the real question, what is the purpose of philosophy? Ms. Jenkins seems to believe that philosophy should function as a weapon, an instrument of change. But historically, the greatest philosophers have sought to understand human nature, not dictate it. He paced slowly as he spoke. When we inject activism into philosophy, we lose its purity. We reduce it to slogans and rhetoric, rather than deep contemplation. True philosophy is about ideas, not agendas. The moment we turn it into a tool for activism, we destroy its essence. He stopped and faced her. So, tell me, Miss Jenkins, if philosophy is merely a means to an end, what happens when that end is wrong? Layla nodded slowly, taking in his argument. That's a fair question, she said. But let's flip it. If philosophy is only about understanding, what happens when that understanding is used to justify oppression? Thornton arched an eyebrow. Take Aristotle, she continued, one of the greatest philosophers of all time. He also justified slavery as a natural part of human order. If philosophy should remain pure, untouched by activism, does that mean we should accept Aristotle's views as valid today? The room was silent. Thornton hesitated for the briefest second before responding. Aristotle was a product of his time. And so are we, Layla interjected, which means we can't just study philosophy. We have to challenge it, push it forward. Otherwise, we're not philosophers, we're archivists. The tension in the room was thick now. Even Thornton seemed to feel it. Tell me, Layla continued, her voice softer now, more deliberate. If philosophy isn't meant to be used for change, then what is its purpose? To sit in dusty books? To be debated in ivory towers while the world burns? Thornton opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since the debate began, he looked unsettled. Layla stepped back, returning to her seat. That's all for now. The class was still. Thornton cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. We'll reconvene next class for closing arguments. But everyone knew he had already lost.